are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the strange case of the EASEY Street murders. Now, these were two best friends who were inseparable. Unfortunately, that was even through death. The most heartbreaking part was that one of them had a baby, and that baby would be left crying in a crib for 3 days. There are a lot of unanswered questions in this case, and many we're not sure we will ever get the answer to. Such as, did the killer call? Was the letter that was sent to the family true? And did the investigators do their jobs? By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you would like to support me in doing that, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. I also want to thank Unsolved Murders True Crime Stories podcast for their brilliant research on this case. Of course, you guys know when it comes to cases in other countries, it's harder for me to find information about them, but because of this podcast, I could find enough information to make this video. So I just want to shout them out. They'll be linked down below as well. So it was 1977 in Australia, and two friends were living in Melbourne in a suburb called Collingwood, and this was Suzanne Armstrong and Suzanne Bartlett, who went by Sue. Now, Susan and Sue were the ultimate best friends. I mean, they were more like sisters at this point, and in fact, they would often be referred to as the two Sues because their names were so similar. They had actually met 14 years prior in high school and had this instant connection, and it wasn't just their names that connected them, it was actually their entire lives. Like, they were just meant to be a part of each other's lives. Sometimes friends from school can just be there to get you through that period of time. However, these seemed like friends who would be there for each other for a lifetime. And Suzanne and Sue were both born in 1949. Sue was just a few months older, and everything about their lives other than this seemed to match up as well, as far as they had the same name, the age, and the same exact families. Because Sue had grown up with a mother who was single and a younger brother, and Suzanne had grown up with a single mother as well, and she had younger siblings. There were actually 3 younger siblings, but it was just so strange that they were both the oldest sibling in a single parent home, and so they just knew what that meant to be an older sibling. And I think sometimes that's really important when you're younger, to find people who understand your home life or understand what you've been through when you're still trying to figure it out yourself. Sue was a bit more of the rebellious one, and Suzanne was not. She was more of the, good girl, did what she was told type of girl. However, they balanced each other out nicely. They were the type where Suzanne could get Sue to calm down and do good things, and Sue could get her out of her shell a little bit. And so music really held them together a lot. When they couldn't decide on what they were going to do, they just listened to some music, and their favorite was actually the Beatles. And this would be the first time that their independence would really show, and the fact that they craved this kind of behavior and wanting to explore more than just where they had grown up. And the Beatles just happened to be coming to Australia when they were kids, and the venue was quite far away, and their parents, of course, or their mothers, being single mothers, couldn't just take them out when they had other children to take care of. And so they decided they would take it into their own hands, buy bus tickets, and go out themselves. Now, I know that they were at least in their teens, older than 14. However, I'm not sure how old they were, or even if they had their parents' permission for this. But this was their first chance at proving if they could handle themselves on their own, and they did a great job. And after this, they craved that same kind of adventure, and they would be partners in crime, doing as much as they possibly could while still being teens. Now, of course, they still had to abide by their parents' rules, and so they didn't get to do a ton, but once they graduated, all bets were off. They were able to do whatever they wanted, and you'd think that the more rebellious Sue, who was actually the Sue and not Suzanne, would be the one who would flee town and, go jump on some sort of tour tour with musicians, but this actually wasn't what happened at all. Suzanne was actually the one to decide to move to the big city of Melbourne, and this was quite a big challenge, and Suzanne was up for it. However, Sue decided she didn't want to go. She actually wanted to stay near her family and to get a job as a teacher at a school to teach arts. Sue always knew she could visit Suzanne in Melbourne, but she just wasn't ready to move away from her family just yet, and Suzanne decided to continue the adventures without her, and Sue couldn't always go. She went when she could, but a lot of the time Suzanne was going alone. And when she was 23, it was actually about a year into her travels, and she would get into a bit of trouble. However, we will get back to this later, and I will elaborate a little further because it comes into the story, but this caused her to finally return to Melbourne, and she was just happy to be home safely at that point. But her longest friend would not be there to greet her when she got back because Sue wasn't even in Australia. She had decided to go on her own adventure as well, and she had gone to Greece. Now, these two were the type of friends that could not speak for months at a time, but when they did speak and got back together, it was the same as it had always been. They were just that kind of connected friendship that everybody yearns for. And so when Suzanne started writing to Sue about her, her own travels, and Sue was talking about how Greece was, they decided that Suzanne should go to Greece so they could travel together again. The only problem with this was that Suzanne didn't have any money. She had spent it all on traveling. So she had to get a job as a taxi driver and work doing that for a while to be able to afford the plane ticket. It was 1994 when they would finally reunite in Greece, and they were in their mid-20s, and they were finally living life as they wanted, as they even planned as teenagers. They were traveling the world together, they were experiencing new things, and they had nothing holding them back. While in Greece, Sue decided that she was going to end her vacation and head back because her teaching job at a new school in the big city of Melbourne was going to be starting, and she had moved there, of course, to try the big city, but also to be closer to Suzanne. But Suzanne wasn't going to be leaving Greece anytime soon, and this wasn't because she hadn't gotten a full vacation or she felt like she needed more time there, but it was because she had fallen in love. She had met a man named Adrian, and she decided that she was going to stay with him for a while. But there was a bit more to this story, because Suzanne was now pregnant. She had written a letter to her sister basically saying that she had gotten pregnant by Adrian and that she was in love with him. So they were going to stay in Naxos, Greece, and marry and have this baby, and they were going to live there for a while. But Suzanne didn't want to live there for the rest of her life, but she knew to get settled into the family routine, she would probably have to stay. In August of 1975, Suzanne was 26 years old. She was 9 months pregnant, and she was not yet married. It had been 9 months, and her and Adrian hadn't yet gotten married because it was a lot harder to do so when they couldn't get the paperwork for Suzanne to come to Greece. And so they were kind of at a standstill with the whole marriage, but it also kind of made things hard because Suzanne was pregnant, Adrian's family had some very strong views on what she could and couldn't do. She couldn't walk, she couldn't hold things, she couldn't lift things, she couldn't raise her arms, and she also couldn't even cross her legs when she was sitting or laying down. So basically, she had to lay down like a mummy with her hands at her side, her legs down, and just do nothing for that 9 months. And this was really hard for Suzanne, who was, of course, someone who traveled all the time, was always on the move, loved adventure, and now she was just stuck at home. Suzanne was becoming miserable and lonely at this point, and she just wanted her baby to be there. And that month, her mother and her stepfather would head to Greece to wait for the arrival of their grandchild. But Gregory would be born soon after, and he was a healthy baby boy. But months would pass, and Adrian and Suzanne just were not getting along. Adrian was kind of drifting farther and farther away from his girlfriend and his son, and Suzanne was doing everything on her own as if she was a single mother, even though Adrian was right there in the home with them. And so she decided to hatch a plan. Gregory was now a year old, and Suzanne told Adrian that she was going to take him home for Christmas that year, and that it was too expensive to get him a plane ticket there as well, but that they would only be there for the holidays and they would be back soon. And this was not necessarily the truth, because Suzanne and Gregory would never return. The first thing that she did when she got back was call her best friend Sue and ask her if she wanted to be her roommate. And Sue was so happy. She had a steady job, she wasn't married, so she could pay. They were just at the perfect points in their life to move in together. So it was now 1977, and Suzanne was 27, Sue was 28, Gregory was 2, and they also had a puppy named Mishka, and they were all living together in perfect harmony. This apartment was at 147 EASEY Street, and this was perfect for them. They had neighbors who loved them and who loved Gregory, so it wasn't a big deal if Gregory was, crying and there were thin walls, because the neighbors were okay with it. They knew that Suzanne was a good mother and would try to soothe him as soon as possible. And Gregory also had his own bedroom, and the rent was cheap enough that it could be afforded by Sue, who was working her teacher's job, and then the money that Suzanne was getting from being a single mother. She wasn't working because Gregory was still so young, couldn't go to daycare yet, or she didn't want him to, and so she was a stay-at-home mom, and this was working really well for all of them. But on January 10th of that year, Gregory would be heard crying by the neighbors, and he was screaming, he was crying, he just sounded pitiful. And the neighbors were, like I said, very used to this, and they knew that Suzanne wouldn't let him cry forever. They just weren't those type of people, and Gregory always was soothed very quickly. However, this would be different, because for the next 3 days, Gregory just screamed and screamed, and the neighbors started to notice that the cries were getting weaker, and that is when they got really concerned. And there were 2 neighbors, their direct neighbors, that were 2 females, and they decided that they would go over and knock on the Sue's door. And when they got no response, they realized that the back door was unlocked, and they decided to peek in and kind of call out for them, but they still weren't responding, and they could still hear Gregory crying. And not knowing what else to do, they walked further in. But that is when they would see a absolutely horrific crime scene. There was blood everywhere. The kitchen light was the only light on, but the answer that they were seeking was now right in front of them, because Sue was lying lifeless, face down on the ground in the hallway. Her feet were black, and they went to search for Suzanne, and they would find her in her own bed, but she was also not breathing. At this point, they worried for Gregory because he wasn't crying anymore. So they ran to him. They found him in his bedroom, in his cot, but thankfully he was still alive. These neighbors grabbed Gregory and ran, knowing not to disturb the rest of the crime scene more than they possibly already had. And that is when the Victoria police finally got there. But it was only one rookie cop. You see, because they had called and the police department didn't believe that this could have actually happened. So they sent this cop to check things out, and really they were just trying to put off doing anything because they believed it was a hoax. But as soon as the cop got there and peered in to see Sue's body, he would call for backup. And that is when the police would finally get there. They then found that Sue, who was in the hallway, had been stabbed 55 times, and it appeared as though she had been running and fighting, and that is why the blood was all over the place. But they would also find Suzanne, who was in her bed, naked from the waist down. Her dress was over her head, and she had 29 stab wounds. There were pools of blood under and above her head. The front of her dress had been torn up, and she had been sexually assaulted. From the scene, the police believed this was done in a blind rage. The brutality of the killings showed that this killer had extraordinary strength, and Gregory at this point was still alive. He was sent to the hospital, but he was extremely dehydrated and he was hungry, and they realized that his mother could have been deceased for days, and that meant Gregory hadn't been helped at all. There was no sign of forced entry. However, the windows and the doors were unlocked and open because they always were. In this time and this place, that's just what everybody did, and they liked to get that fresh air and they weren't scared. And so they didn't know necessarily if the killer had just walked in one of these places or jumped in a window. But then in Sue's bedroom, they would find that the window that was open had the curtains that had fallen down off of it, and there was also a muddy footprint found on Suzanne's bed sheets that were nearby. They believed this is where the killer could have entered and that their death had been 3 days prior, meaning Gregory screamed for 3 days, not understanding why his mom wouldn't just come to him. There was also blood found all over the bathroom, and neither of these victims had appeared to go in there, but it was in the bathtub, and the investigators, as well as the sink, and the investigators really started to believe that the killer had gone in there to try to wash themselves off, whether that was, the blood from the crime scene, or whether they had gone around and kind of scrubbed the rooms and then tried to wash themselves, because it was found that there wasn't a ton of blood found near these bodies, or not as much as there should have been. There was still a ton there, but there should have been even more for the brutality of what actually happened. And so that is when they began to look at the bathroom, and they would find that most of it was cleaned up in there. However, near the plug and the drain, there was still blood. A bloodstained towel was also found in the living room on the sofa, and investigators would talk to neighbors around the area, and they would ask if they had heard anything, and none of them really had. There were no thumps, no yelling, no strange people, but the two women who had found them had said that it was just the fact that Gregory had been crying, but some of the neighbors hadn't even heard that. Although, was this the truth? Or were there statements that weren't really recorded by investigators? It was said that some of the neighbors had heard and seen things, but this wasn't made a priority by police to keep up with these statements or to go and question them further, because there was actually an elderly woman who had trouble sleeping who lived nearby, and she was constantly looking out her window, taking care of the neighborhood. She felt like it was her duty. And so the night of the murders, she actually had seen a man in the Sue's kitchen washing his hands and walking about in the middle of the night. She said he seemed calm, and after a little while, he just walked out the back door, out the fence, and left. Now, it was dark and she couldn't really see his face, but they had never gotten a description from her to see if she could possibly make a sketch out of what she had seen. There was also another neighbor who had heard a sound at 2:30 a.m., and this was 2 doors shutting. And this made people believe maybe there were 2 killers. Investigators were just looking for one, but this showed that there could possibly have been 2. This man didn't see anything, so he couldn't be sure that there were 2 people or what they looked like, but he had heard that noise. An editor named Tess Lawrence of Independence Australia newspaper was brought in to do a piece on this case, and she was actually asked to go to the home, look at the crime scene, and then talk about it in order to get it out there to see if anybody would come forward after seeing all of this. And she went to the crime scene and could barely look at the bloodied wall. She said it was so horrific in there even after the bodies had been removed, and that she met with family members after that and interviewed them, seeing if she could find out more things about these 2 women that could connect to why they were murdered. And a lot of these family members were saying that not even the police had interrogated them or even questioned them, Of course, they wouldn't want them to come and think that they had done it, but they hadn't even asked them who the Sues were beyond that they were just victims. Then it was realized that a knife had been found, but it wasn't at the home. It was actually randomly found at Victoria Park Railway Station the day that the Sues were murdered, and it was already brought in before they even knew that these two women had been murdered, and they tested it against the wounds to the women and found that it could have been the murder weapon, that the killer had dumped it not too far away from the crime scene and then went and took the railway station to get out of there. And there was no blood on the actual knife, on the blade, but there was on the handle, and this type of blood matched Suzanne's, but none of Sue's blood type was found. A further search of the community would find a bloodied washcloth in a drain 2 blocks from the apartment, and a dry cleaner actually came forward saying that a man had come in with blood-stained pants and they had cleaned it, and he had already come and picked it up because they hadn't heard about these murders yet, and they just wanted to give that information in case it would help. Investigators would also find that there was an odd middle-aged man who went to the hospital on the 10th, the day that these women were murdered, and his hands were covered in blood. He was asking people to help him, but when they said that he had to fill out paperwork saying his name and his address, he got angry and he fled. And there was also a note found in the home on the kitchen table under the ashtray asking Suzanne to call him back. This was apparently from a man named Barry, and Barry wanted him to call her back. They just needed to find out who Barry was and when he was in the home. Investigators would then be trying to piece together the days prior to the murder, and they would fast forward to January 10th, before the Sues were thought to be murdered, and this is when Gregory started crying. But before that, it was said that the Sues were out and about and they were social, and lots of people had seen them that day. That morning, Sue had actually gone shopping with her mother, and this was great for the two of them because Sue's mother was a bit, annoyed with her for getting an apartment with Suzanne, saying that she was a bad influence, and they were just finally getting back on good terms, Sue and her mother, and they were actually going out for lunch. They had a great time, and then they went home, and that night Sue's brother and her brother's girlfriend would come over, as they often did, and Sue had actually invited them so that her brother could fix her radio at about 7 p.m. that night, and then they would have dinner and they would watch TV and sit on the couch watching the Sullivans. And at 10 p.m. Gregory was in bed, and Sue's brother and girlfriend would head out, saying that they would make some dinner plans for later that week. But the next day no one would be able to get a hold of them in their own home, and in fact that is when they would find out who Barry was, because Suzanne had been seeing a man named Barry Woodward, and he would say that he had gone to their home and he rang the doorbell. The next day, because he hadn't heard from her, they were supposed to go on a date, and this wasn't like her just to not answer. So when no one answered, he decided to leave. He called her and he figured that she would get back to him, that maybe she was just busy with her son. But when the whole day went by and Suzanne still didn't get back to him, he decided to go back to her apartment. It was January 12th, and Barry actually brought his brother with him to go and see if anything was wrong, and the back door was unlocked. He found it that way, so he peeked in, he called out their names, but they didn't answer. Now, he would only walk into the kitchen area, which was right where you walked in when you walked in the door, and you couldn't see the hallway from there. You had to walk in a little bit further to actually see anything. And so, little did he know, after he wrote the note in the kitchen and walked out the door, that he was feet away from seeing what had actually happened. Now, Barry didn't mention Gregory crying at all, and the neighbors said that he was crying by this point, but maybe he had stopped when he heard someone walk in the door. But Barry never said he heard anything like that or anything strange at all. However, when that third day rolled around, the female neighbors had heard him crying and were starting to get worried, because not only did they hear crying, they also had found the Sue's puppy Mishka just roaming the streets, and decided to take her in and, let the Sues know. They went and knocked on their door. They wrote a note to them saying, "Dear Suze, we have your dog, which was just wandering around the street. You are obviously not home, so give us a yell, and we will return home to you promptly. Regards, Iona and Jeanette." And so they took this puppy home, and the next day, with Gregory still crying, and the puppy still in their home that no one had collected, they decided it was time to do something. and that is why they walked in that home that day. There was nothing stolen, meaning that the motive was probably not robbery, and because Suzanne was sexually assaulted, they thought that maybe it was a sexual motive, but they still weren't sure. Sue's room was a mess, as though she had fought there and out to the hallway, and so she was so close to the door, but she just hadn't made it. But Suzanne's room wasn't messy at all, other than where she was, and there was no sign of a struggle, so investigators began to work on a theory that possibly Suzanne knew the killer and had let them in that day, and that is why she was the only one sexually assaulted. There was even an upside down book near her bed, as though she had heard somebody knock. She had placed it down like she was expecting somebody, and she walked out to greet them. However, it could have been Sue that was bombarded first, which is why the bloody footprint was on her bed, and then Suzanne came after. Investigators really had no idea at this point what had happened. One of the first suspects was, of course, Barry, because he was the boyfriend of one of the victims, and he had left that note, and they didn't know how he could have been in the home and not seen anything or heard Gregory cry. And he was saying he really didn't know anything was happening. He just dropped the note and left because he already felt weird about going in and like invading their privacy before just walking out. But the police weren't so sure about this. His brother had gone with him and corroborated his story, but since he was family, they couldn't actually trust this, and so that couldn't be confirmed. But after 8 detectives questioned Barry, he was let go because nothing connected him further than that note. The problem was DNA could not be tested because it was still the 1970s, and they would have to wait another 20 years for any of the evidence that they found to mean anything. They had collected the bodily fluids from Suzanne, but the blood in the bathroom was a bit contaminated because apparently an officer who had gotten blood on himself and decided to go in the bathroom and wash it off in the sink. The detectives didn't have to wait for forensics to come at this time. They didn't have to wear any like protective gear at the crime scene. They just walked on in and probably ruined a ton of different articles of DNA and evidence, but they didn't know that that would even be possible in the future. At this point, DNA wouldn't be able to help them anyways, which was unfortunate, especially because there were so many suspects to sift through, and they couldn't necessarily rule them out because they didn't have the DNA to do so. And they began to look at enemies of the Sues, or possible enemies, dark pieces of their past, and the only thing they could really find was what I was talking to you about Suzanne on her traveling experiences and the reason she had to go home to Melbourne. And this was because she was in Miami, Florida, and this was towards the end of her traveling, and she had started to get low on money, and she had told a guy this at a party, and he said that luckily he had a job that she could do for $400. All she would have to do was travel to Bogota, Colombia, grab a suitcase full of emeralds, and bring them back. The man had told her that because she was a girl, she wouldn't be looked at. It wouldn't be strange if she did this, but it would be if he did. So that's why she was being asked to do it. And she was very suspicious, but she needed the money, so she decided to take the job. However, she would quickly realize this was the wrong choice, because she would get to Colombia and she would be picking up cocaine, and she would now need to smuggle it through customs. Now, the drugs were hidden in the lining of the suitcase. However, they would stop to search her, and she would have to pray that they did not find it, because she would be in so much trouble. And somehow she got through the searches and boarded the plane without getting caught. However, she would get back to Florida, and this man would simply take the cocaine and say she wasn't getting paid, and that it was just the drug smuggling business, and that's how it worked. Suzanne didn't argue. She just went home to Australia and had to make money from there. She hadn't kept the drugs from this man. She hadn't even argued about the money, so although it was a strange piece of her history, it didn't necessarily point to motive, and it didn't appear she had ever had any other trouble in, the drug department at all. It's not like she did drugs. So they began to look at other suspects, and that is when Gregory's father was brought into the picture. Of course, Adrian had a lot of trouble with Suzanne. Suzanne had left him and taken their child to a completely different place. And when they started to look into him, they thought maybe this could be a motive. However, they also found he had never stepped foot in Australia, which made it a little bit hard to do something like this, unless he had perhaps hired a hitman. Well, if it wasn't Susan's ex or her current boyfriend, what about Sue's? Well, they had found that Sue had a sort of secret admirer that wasn't so secret. He was an unnamed tobacco salesman, and this man truly seemed to be in love with Sue, or definitely want to be her boyfriend. And he would actually come forward and admit that he had entered Sue's bedroom that day by her window. And this is how the muddy footprint has gotten on her bedsheet, because he said he was drunk that night and he had tried calling her, but she never answered. So he was going in to see if he had had the wrong number and to see if he could get the real one. Although he said that he did this on the evening of the 11th, so it would be the day after the murders. And the man said he didn't see any bodies, nor did he hear Gregory crying, but he said it was dark and he left pretty soon after. And after hearing this whole story, the detectives were baffled that he had come in himself and confessed about doing this, because it was definitely a very strange thing to do. But after questioning him, they didn't believe he had seen anything or done anything. He had just simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time and felt guilty about going there and leaving that footprint, and had confessed. Now, there would be a few neighbors that would catch the detectives' eyes because they were quite strange, and a lot of the other neighbors in the area had talked about these people as well. And the first was a man named Steve Cox, who was an artist and a neighbor, and he was extremely interested in these murders, wanting to help detectives in any way. They just didn't know if he was a concerned friend or a gloating killer. He was thought to be strange, but the police found nothing to connect him to the murders, and so they kind of just let that suspect go and didn't believe he had anything to do with it. But the next neighbor suspect was a more likely one, and he wasn't even necessarily a neighbor. You see, he was actually already on many people's radars, and including the police, because his name was John Grant, and he was a local journalist who had also been a suspect in a disappearance of a woman 2 years prior. You see, Julie Ann Garcisale was 20 years old when she would be visiting Melbourne, the north of Melbourne, in 1975. And she was a brilliant pianist and a creative soul, and she had actually lived in California. She worked there, but she had relocated to Melbourne to be with her sister Gail, because her sister was feeling very homesick and wanted her to come over and stay with her for a little while. So she decided she would take a year and she would live there with her sister. And they planned to go back to California together once that year was over. They were going to be staying at Gail's flat on Canning Street, and Julie would also get a job at a local library as a clerk, and it was at the South Down Press. Julie met many people who would be coming in to research different things. Of course, Google wasn't a thing, so people actually had to go and read books if they wanted to learn about anything. They couldn't just do it from the comforts of their home. And so on July 1st, 3 men would go into the library. They would introduce themselves to Julie. They would say that they were researching food and be talking to her about a soul food restaurant that they were wanting to open. And this was one source that said that. Other sources said that they were in there researching police corruption. But either way, later that day, Julie, who had some sort of conversation with them, decided that she would invite them over to hang out at her apartment, because, you know, she was making friends in this new place. She was trying to find herself and become her own person, so she wasn't just relying on her sister and her friends. And so she invited these 3 men over that seemed innocent enough. But of course we know that wouldn't be the case. Her sister Gail had spent the night at a friend's house that night, and so she would get home around 4 p.m. The next day. She would call out for Julie, but Julie wasn't answering, and so when she walked into the kitchen, she found Julie's clothes scattered about, and this was completely unlike her. There was a pair of blue jeans and a striped top on the floor, as well as a bra and a pair of underwear that was cut up and scattered about, and these all belonged to Julie. Gail thought this was really weird and ran to Julie's room, where she found a leather belt and Julie's slip. On her bed was a blood-stained towel. and the bed itself had bloodstains on it. Gail then searched the apartment further and found that Julie left her keys, her wallet, and a handwritten note with a number on it. These were all things she would need to leave. So why were they still there? And why was she not? Gail called the police and told them that the only things missing were a carving knife and a black cape. The glass door had also been busted, and $125 had also come up missing. It was believed that Julie had left the house only wearing a black velvet cape, which I assume would be like a coat, but these 3 men were found and questioned. They were Rise Collins, who was a boxer who went by Tommy, John Joseph Power, and none other than journalist John Grant. These 3 men would say that that night they all drank while listening to records, and then 2 of the men would decide that they were going to go pick up pizza, and 1 man would stay with Julie to talk to her. And at around 11:15, these 2 men came back with the pizza, and this man was alone. He would say that Julie had gone off to the phone booth to make a call. This was a call to PMG's Overseas Telecommunications section, which is, I guess, where Gail worked, her sister, and she was supposed to tell them that Gail wasn't coming in because she was at her friend's. The man said that Julie had taken a piece of paper with a number on it as well as a few coins, and that she said that she would be back. But when she never returned, the 3 men simply left. It was never specified which man stayed with Julie that night, so we don't really know that, but this is how the story was told, and detectives weren't so sure that that was the truth. There were definitely inconsistencies in the statements between these 3 men. The story was looked into, and PMG said that they never returned, or they never received a call that night from anybody, and these men denied having any involvement with her disappearance, but John Grant was not yet cleared as a possible suspect. The search ensued, but Julie was never found. There was actually a possible sighting of her at one point in Hong Kong, as a TV reporter was over there that looked just like her, but when they sent the dental records to see if it was a match, it came back as negative. Now, the same year that the Sues were found murdered, which would mean 4 years after Julie was disappeared, they got a tip in her investigation. It was in May, so 4 months after the Sues were murdered, and the police would receive a tip saying that Julie's body could be found dumped in an abandoned well near Smithsdale in central Victoria. And when the police got there, they searched it and they couldn't find anything. A psychic even reached out saying that they could see where she was and gave a map of her body, but this didn't turn up anything either. These 3 men were never charged in Julie's disappearance, but they had gotten in a lot of trouble throughout their lives and in those 4 years while they were released between Julie's disappearance and the Sue's murders. Now, John Joseph Power had spent 30 years in prison for vicious sexual assault, theft, armed robberies, and deception, and he even escaped prison twice. And 3 years prior to Julie's vanishing, John Joseph was actually acquitted for murdering another woman. Rise Collins, the boxer who went by Tommy, was known for having a string of criminal convictions, but they weren't nearly as bad as John Joseph's. And the other man, John Grant, the journalist, well, as we know, 2 years later, he would be looked at in a double homicide. But I told you he wasn't necessarily a neighbor. So, let me explain. You see, John Grant was hanging out with a coworker the night of the Sue's murders, and they were drinking at home, and they got way too drunk and decided that John should not leave. He should sleep there that night. They had a blow-up mattress, and that he was just going to spend the night and wake up the next morning and be able to go to work. The actual neighbor of the Sues, the woman who had let John Grant stay, woke up the next morning. They were still hungover and kind of drowsy, and John was already up, dressed, and ready to go. The Sues had been murdered that night, and these 2 women that had let John Grant stay were the 2 that would find them. Investigators began to question John as to where he was that night, and they believed that since he was a crime reporter, he would have known to, wash himself off and perhaps try to wash the crime scene, and he was too intoxicated to actually finish all of it, which is why there was still tons of blood there, why they could find blood in the bathroom, and the day after the murders, they questioned him incessantly, but they found nothing to connect him either. Now, later on down the line, DNA evidence would be able to be tested. And all of these suspects came back as a negative to testing to the crime scene. Now, do you remember the article written in the Independent Australia newspaper? The author Tess Lawrence and everything she did? Well, she would end up getting a very strange call after she posted this. She answered without a clue how important this would be to the case, and this man, or this male voice, said that he wanted to talk about her article. He began to criticize everything she wrote, saying that she wasn't as smart as she thought she was, and that she had left out a ton of what was in the Sue's apartment, that she had left out what was playing in the record player. And she hadn't written what was in the record player. She hadn't written everything because she didn't want somebody to be able to fake being a killer, come up with all of this evidence that they had from what she wrote rather than that they just knew the crime scene. And so she knew that she was talking to someone who knew something more. And at this point, she was on the phone and she was trying to get a hold of her coworker, who was in the room, to try to get them to phone the police to trace the call. Tess told this man to call the police if he knew something, and the caller was getting more and more annoyed, and Tess said that if he wanted her to know more, she would love to, and that they should meet up. And he said that they could, and he also said that he was at the Victoria Barracks and worked in signals, but he wouldn't give her a name and he would have to call her back. Now, Tess was hung up so abruptly they couldn't get a trace on where he was, and he never called back. Still to this day, no one knows if this was the killer, and when Tess told the police that this had happened, they didn't call her back either. They didn't want to know more. It was said that all of this negligence was because there wasn't a lot of detectives at this department at the time, and they didn't share cases between departments either, so it would cause huge problems. And of course, that would cause problems in this case as well. And there was also a different theory as to why there was negligence, and that was that another suspect was the cause of all of this. And when the suspect had light shone on them, we would all get a different perspective. And that was that this killer was possibly a former policeman who had known Suzanne. Apparently, a few years before these murders, this police officer was kicked off the force for sexually harassing women when he pulled them over, and that's when his wife left him. He became an alcoholic. He was working construction that was right near the apartment at the time, and this man had never had his name released, and they said they questioned him several times, and no statement that he made was ever the same. But they wouldn't do anything about it, and 20 years later, this case is still unsolved. Gregory was adopted by Suzanne's sister, Gail, after his father, Adrian, said he didn't want to raise him. Like I said, the DNA found on Suzanne was tested against all of these suspects. There was said to be 8 in total, and they were all supposedly cleared. They also didn't connect to anyone in the Australian database, and although some say this bodily fluid sample was near Suzanne's body and not really on it, although others say the sample was actually contaminated and was misplaced for a while in the police department and could possibly not even be the correct sample at all. But 6 years after that, it was now 2004, and another lead would come in because Suzanne's stepfather would get a letter in the mail, and this said, "Dear Bert, it's terribly sad that your wife and the 2 families were cheated because of the criminal negligence of the Narundle Hospital, and then to add assault to injury, the homicide squad have known for 4 years and 5 months that Jack Christie could be the Easy Street Killer, but chose pathetic side games instead of a proper investigation." This man was said to be a patient at the Narundle Hospital when a man named Jack Christie was admitted. He was in a coma when he got there, but 10 days later he would wake up. Apparently in group therapy he would say that often after being with a woman sexually, he would have a feeling that he wanted to put a carving knife inside of them and kill them. And this man who had written the letter said that he didn't believe that Suzanne was sexually assaulted, but that she had let Jack in. that they were having a relationship. That maybe Jack had told Suzanne he had killed a couple of people and she had threatened him with the police, and that is when he killed her. Barry, who was Suzanne's boyfriend at the time, said this wasn't possible, that him and Suzanne were actually talking about marriage and they were just seeing each other. However, I mean, I guess there's a possibility that she was seeing other men, but there was nothing connecting her to this Jack Christie. This man who had written the letters offered to meet the family, and when they denied, he went to Suzanne's son Gregory, who was now of course in his 20s, and Gregory also denied this, and this made the man really upset, and he decided to go to these EASEY Street apartments and leave a letter with every single neighbor saying that Jack Christie had killed them. He even went to the man who now lived at 147 EASEY Street. In 2007, this man would not stop contacting the family, and they finally took this to the police and said, look, is there anything to his theories? Can we just put this behind us? And that's when the police said, please ignore everything that he's saying. He does this all the time to many murder victims' families, trying to get them all riled up, playing a game with them. And Jack Christie had died nearly a decade ago, so it's not like they could even question him now. Fast forward to 2017, and the Victoria Police Department would offer a $1 million reward, saying, while DNA testing has not uncovered an offender thus far, it has provided a useful tool in eliminating suspects and remains a very strong line of inquiry. So please, if you know anything, call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. This case is quite the mysterious one. Who do you think the killer was? Was it even one of the suspects that I talked about? Was it the man who was involved in another woman's disappearance? Because her case is still unsolved today. The boyfriend who was at the home to leave a note and saw nothing else? The former officer that had gone even more rogue? Any more theories you have about the information I provided you? To me, this is one of the most eerie cases, and I can't figure out why. I've done many cases that are more horrific, many cases that are unsolved, and this one just has a different feeling to me. I think there was so much more going on than we have any idea about. And it breaks my heart for that little boy who grew up without a mother. If you want any more survival stories, please leave me any you want down below. I'm going to try to do a lot more in this upcoming month while we are all stuck indoors and worried about our own survival. I think it's just, it shows hope, it shows strength, and it's what we all need right now. So yeah, leave me any recommendations down below, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.